It's good to see everyone. I am so excited to be here. So yes, I am Vanessa Lowe. Little background. I am a, a product of the Great Migration. My parents met at an HBCU in North Carolina back in the early 60s, and they decided to leave the South, and they took that trek to New York City. So I was born in Harlem, raised in the Bronx, and my parents were servant leaders, I'll say. And so that is part of my why. Why do I do this work? Because I was introduced to it as a child, watching my parents engage with the church, be leaders in the church, watching my mother, who was a social worker for the city of New York, doing very hard work in New York City for about 25, 30 years. My father was a correction officer at Sing Sing for most of his career. And as I got older and started having my own sort of like, what am I going to do with my life? I realize now how much that influenced me, as it should. The summary is that most recently, my summary is that I spent 21 years in federal service working on access to capital for underserved communities. I spent time at U.S. Treasury's Community Development Financial Institution, about 10 years, about 7 years there, about 10 years at the National Credit Union Administration, and I closed out my federal career with 2 years at the Economic Development Administration, distributing disaster funds for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I retired early from federal service, and now I'm spending my time really doing a deep dive into essentially reparations. And I'm doing that through doing the stuff that I was doing before, but on my own terms, if that makes sense. And my connection to Boston Ujima is I am Unitarian Universalist, and I have been on essentially the association's endowment committee twice in my lifetime. Once when I went to DC and worked for Treasury about 20 years ago, and then I came back on the committee in 2019, and I was managing, or tasked again with managing the community investments. And there had been a couple of little projects sitting around not having made a decision yet because they didn't quite fit our portfolio. And one of them was this Boston Ujima project. And I was like, this is what we should be funding. So I was very proud to shepherd that investment in Boston Ujima in as one of the first things I did when I got back on committee. I'll talk more about my work with the UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association, as we go through the conversation, but those are the highlights to start.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And just a note, this is up to you. A couple of people are saying your video is choppy. The audio is fine, but your video is choppy. So just a note. Derek, thank you so much, Vanessa. And as Vanessa said, we'll have a chance to dig more into all of the things Vanessa talked about. Derek?
Yes, thanks, Nia. And welcome, everyone. My name is Derek Peebles, and I currently reside in Cincinnati, Ohio. My current role in the work that I do now, I serve as a senior director of inclusive economy for the American Sustainable Business Network. A lot of that work is really just involved around recognizing the importance of building an inclusive economy that really serves not only the needs of small businesses, but also place-based entrepreneurs, as well as the unique needs that communities are facing. So a lot of the work really involves building peer networks, working on initiatives that strengthen place-based financing, and advocating for what we call restorative investments are just a few ways that we work with communities. And so, of course, this is also at the intersection of climate and economic justice. But my previous work I would say over 10 years now has really been involved in working with faith-based communities and leveraging their assets for the community. And I can get into more deeper detail on kind of what that looks like. But essentially, there was an initiative that we built in Cincinnati some years ago that was a ministry out of the Episcopal Church called the Economics of Compassion Initiative. And we formed probably back in 2017 with the mission of really engaging the public, both secular and religious, in conversations around the visions of what economics of compassion could look like. And we promoted these examples of local neighborhood economics. And so the covenants that we really worked on was that we believe and we know that there are social, cultural, and spiritual values at the center of each community that take precedence over market value, especially when we come to investing. And these really call for restoring the common good. And that's where I think faith-based institutions have a real role to play. When you look at specifically in the Black community, the church has always been the number one asset in a community where people could gather, regardless of their religion, but could gather and focus on things that were good for the neighborhood. So yes, that's the work that I've been involved in, and look forward to going into more detail.
Excellent. Thank you, Derek. And we can actually do that right now. So that was a perfect setup. That was a perfect segue. You have a framework for this that you've just talked about, economics of compassion. You've told us a little bit. Can you dive deeper first? There are lots of, one thing is I'm interested in focusing on the word compassion in this framework. So one of the things that we've done, or one of the conversations that we've tried to spark with the Assembly of Black Possibilities, and you've been a part of this, is definitely thinking about the words that we use, the phrases that we use, the terms. So even when we think about investment, impact investing, etc., definitely a lot of thought goes into how we describe our work. So if you can talk just a little bit about how the framework came to be titled Economics of Compassion, and then yes, please offer more detail on the economics of compassion.
Sure. Well, in simple terms, the economics of compassion was a concept that was really born out of the phrase beloved community that the Episcopal Church had established some time ago, along with other denominations as well. And part of what the economics of compassion meant and really recognized was that we all are people that have something to contribute to our neighborhoods, to our families, to our schools, to our whole society. And it also recognizes that we are living in an era where traditional economic practices and frameworks are really being challenged. And so this concept of an economics of compassion and beloved community is emerging as viable alternatives to looking at how to catalyze community well-being and prosperity. And so the concept recognizes that the current economic system is really limited in its ability to address the needs of society and the environment. And it seeks to really shift mindsets towards a more holistic understanding of value. And when you're looking at investment, that's really important, is really how can we redefine value? And so we explored a lot of these when we engaged the different public and religious sectors to help determine their role in their neighborhood and in their local economy as it aligned to principles of beloved community. And so, the importance of really shifting mindsets towards a more holistic understanding of value is really something that can't be overstated. This really involves us reevaluating what we consider valuable, as we're working with entrepreneurs, as we're working in our communities. When we look at what we call the real estate cartel, and how often people in communities do not have a role of how they want their neighborhood to look. And that's determined by real estate developers. And so it's just recognizing new forms of defining and accessing private, social, and public capital as viable resources for creating an economy that really works for all. And so it also requires us to think beyond traditional metrics when we're measuring progress.
Excellent, thank you. I have a follow-up question, but I'll hold it. Vanessa, so similarly with you, and you've started to talk about this a little bit, intentionally or not, we bring all of ourselves to our work. What part of your values and or personal bio experience shows up in your work in this arena that you'd like to delve into a little more here?
Yeah, I told you about my parents and their work as social workers and working in the correction system. But it's interesting that I remember like sort of like filling in one of those values statements one time, and thank goodness they handed out a list, a long list, because we didn't have those conversations in school, and I'm a product of the Bronx public school system, remember? So it was really helpful to have a list. And now we have things like, we have a lot of different lists. The, what is it, the UN, I forget what they're called, the principles, what is it, 17 different principles that look at what have the countries committed to in terms of making the world better. So my values, let me start with that right now, really go along with who am I working with, but they're mostly consistent. My most local commitment at the foundation level is with a group called Valentine Foundation, 37-year-old foundation founded by a woman whose granddad left her some money. She is committed. She was probably one of the early feminists and was really committed to helping women and girls. And so that has been their mission. I've worked with that foundation for the last 5 years. And by the time I came on, they were already had shifted from doing just social service funding to social change funding. How do we go upstream, solve the issue that's creating the need for these sort of grants that we're making? Let's try to solve the problem. So I've worked with them as we have completely changed our investment policy statement. And that involved us sort of honing on what are our values, because if you want to move to what we said, which was 100% values alignment, not just the 5% we're giving away at the foundation, but looking at our whole portfolio. If we want to align our money 100%, we need to be clear on what those values are. And so we landed on gender justice and racial justice. So to have this clear and brief investment policy statement that puts that out there has been so helpful for clarifying with our financial partners, our other foundations, whoever we partner with, these are our values. So I say that all to say this issue of knowing what your values are is really important, because it helps you to focus and say, is this in alignment with what my goals are for how I want to change the world? Racial is in line with reparations, which is part of the work I do. And so when I work with the UUA, overall, the whole purpose of that endowment and our committees is to help all of the churches who invest in that endowment, to give them the confidence that we are investing the funds in a way that is in alignment with UU values. And again, the UUs talk a lot about and sometimes implement things around racial justice. They've been very clear, I would say, in writing around dismantling white supremacy. They have not yet made a commitment of 100% mission alignment. But again, this is all part of the work, right? So these are the kind of things that that I work on. And those are the sort of two primary values, but other values for me is the sort of having an impact in the world. I realized that fairly early. I have two wonderful sisters and they have daughters. And I don't have any children. So my legacy is not going to be the people who I've created, right? So I've often thought of the work that I do as like, that's my legacy. So being able to influence and essentially talk people into doing stuff that I think is going to put us in a better place is another value. And so thank you for this opportunity to try to talk some people into doing some stuff.
Thank you, Vanessa. I really appreciate that. And yet I have one more scene setting question for both of you. Really important. And we've started a lot of our conversations with the assembly with this values question with who you are and how it shapes why you've chosen the work that you've chosen and how you participate. And just really trying to show values are always at work. To your point, Vanessa, whether or not they're explicit, or whether or not they are tacit. So I have one more scene setting question before we then start to kind of dive into some details. And this is for both of you. Our experiences with faith are varied in multiple ways. And I'm going to ask you both to take up to 5 minutes to answer this question. What current realities and changes in the faith landscape are important to note? And why are they important? And I'll put that in the chat as well so you can reference that. I see Vanessa taking a deep breath. So do you want to start first, Derek?
Sure. You know, it's interesting because now we're talking about faith, right? I mean, with what's going on in the Middle East now, the issue of multicultural, multi-faith interaction and collaboration is so critical, right? I mean, we have got to work together. If it's called crossing the aisles or whatever, we have got to get out of our silos. We've watched what's happened in the political with people sort of going deeper into these silos, and that we know that that's not healthy. With what's going on in the Middle East, this is not new, but we are reminded now with the level of violence and horror that we're seeing that we've got to start with these are our neighbors. These are human beings. I know that we sometimes do horrible things to each other over time, but we have got to figure out how to work together. So that collaborative work in literally multi-faith organizations is critical. Is it okay now if I talk about how I do that, or is it too soon?
Too soon.
I'll give some examples if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
multi-faith. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say we have a whole section for examples for you, Vanessa.
Okay. So I'll put that out there as I think one of the most important things is multi-faith work.
Okay. Derek, thank you, Vanessa.
I would say that, you're exactly right. The people's experience with religion and faith-based institutions can be varied. And so taking that into account, one of the things that I typically stayed away from conversations on politics and conversations where it regards faith. And I think, more now than ever, that's exactly really what we need to be talking about. When you look at all of the major religions in the world, they all find the same hallowed ground as sacred, and right now there's a war in that region. And so, I think very deeply about that. But I also think that faith can mean many things for different people. And I think, there's a reason why me as a Christian and as an Episcopalian, I'm able to say that, part of why the Episcopal Church, is kind of like we refer to ourselves as Catholic, but not Catholic, really. It's kind of how we refer to ourselves. And essentially, um, you know, that means that we have more of an Anglican background versus recognizing papal authority. And so there's so many different denominations among Christianity, though. And really, the discussion is really about faith. And when you think about impact investing and when you think about wanting to see our neighborhoods and our children thrive, and we all want to live in a world where there's peace and where, we're all getting along. But I think a lot of the current economic system, quite honestly, has driven us to the world that we really live in today. And I think we all have something to contribute to that, because, no matter the harm that's been done on minorities here in America, America has created a great capacity for evil, I think, when you look at what's happening in the world. But we all have a choice to identify where we're spending our own dollars. And what I mean by that is that we all have the option to look at, if we have a job where if we've worked for an employer for some time, we probably have some type of retirement account that's invested in some type of fund that we really don't know what's behind it. And I think, as an impact investor, it's not about being wealthy and being able to invest for impact. We're all impact investors in a sense of being able to recognize where we spend our money, because we have the choice of where we want to spend our dollar. Now, it's a lot harder for people who are in marginalized communities, for people who live in food deserts, for people, where transportation, and you may see high crime areas and things like that. But we all have the opportunity to put conditions in place to control where our dollars are spent and to bring those dollars back to our own community, so those dollars can circulate and we can begin to take care of our own. So without rambling, I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Derek. And I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then Vanessa, you'll have the last one, and that's where you can take it away. But when we were prepping for this, Derek, you mentioned a stat that I had certainly never heard before. So I'm gonna ask you to talk about that in terms of kind of changes that are coming. That's one part of the question. And then of course in talking about that, talk about the implications that you see. And then the second part of this question, and maybe it's the same answer, is if you can talk about an example of how the economics of compassion actually played out in terms of implementation. So if you have some type of example or case study, for lack of a better word, but if you could tackle those two. And I think we have time, yeah. And then I have the giant question for Vanessa, and that'll be our last question before Q&A.
Sure, and I'll be brief. I think I'll take the latter part of the question first, that there are examples of economics of compassion everywhere around us, and a lot of us are working on these type of projects. And so the economics of compassion is just really putting a name to it. But when you look at different areas where you have faith-based institutions investing in community land trust, you have different community investment funds that are created that allows for non-accredited investors. Non-accredited meaning that generally, if you want to invest in a real estate project, you have to have a certain amount of wealth in, and you have to be what is called an accredited investor. But there are community investment funds that are being created where we can direct our own dollars into these funds. We can self-direct individual retirement accounts into development projects in our neighborhood. So, for example, we have created, which is a very new financial vehicle called a diversified community investment fund. And what that is that it really allows us, and here in Cincinnati, we've worked with the Port Authority, which operates Cincinnati's land bank, and we were able to acquire a 3-acre plot of land in a historically Black neighborhood. And we were able to obtain site control to propose a $20 million mixed-use development that's going to be kind of one of the initial projects of building a Black Wall Street here in Cincinnati. And one of the ways that this fund is going to operate is really like a real estate trust. However, the difference is that this fund is going to operate in an opportunity zone. And not only is it going to provide tax benefits for institutional investors and wealthy donors, but it's also going to allow the opportunity for regular average Cincinnatians to invest in their neighborhood. And so this fund really kind of works like a side by side, whereas you have kind of regulation crowdfunding that's involved, where community members will be able to have a say in how the development looks, how it feels, what does it align with the character of the neighborhood, all of those things. And so people will be able to invest in this thing and actually have a say of how development and design happens in their neighborhoods. And so this is an attempt to be able to bring back those dollars into our neighborhood and to keep them circulating. I would say the earlier point that you made in your question is that there is really an opportunity for us now when we're looking at how faith-based communities can really be involved. And so there are statistics out there. I actually can't share one here after this call, but over the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to need to deal with the 60,000 church buildings that will become vacant over the next 5 years. And moving these properties to the tax base could really provide funds for more equitable development. And so these are some of the ways that faith-based communities can really get involved, because as churches are going to begin to start closing, they already are closing en masse, and we're looking at 60,000 church buildings becoming vacant over the next 5 years. A lot of this land is located in areas where in neighborhoods that are marginalized. And so, like I said earlier in this conversation, part of the economics of compassion is recognizing that the church building, regardless of what faith you believe in, that the church building is often one of the biggest assets that a neighborhood has. And so looking at how local congregations through their mission funds and through their mission could really philanthropically like invest in community equity investments to create greater connections to their local economies. And there are many other ways, to go about doing this. We feel like, and the reason we chose a diversified community investment fund is that it really operates more like a real estate trust. And the reason that we have created this type of community investment fund is because we feel in Cincinnati, and a lot of our faith-based leaders feel, that Black communities really will not be able to start generating wealth until we start taking back control of land.
Excellent. Thank you, Derek. And that was great with the timing. So last question will be for you, Vanessa. So taking into account the current and changing landscape, what can congregations do? What can individual congregants do? What is the role of individuals who are not tightly affiliated with a congregation in this conversation? And then and this is your opportunity to essentially kind of talk about all of the very active concrete opportunities.
Okay. So let me tell you what's going on here in Philadelphia. And love what Derek was sharing. And I'm going to talk about a group that you have had profiled, and I think you've already worked with them. Kensington Corridor Trust is a group in Kensington, which I think wherever you are in the country, you may have heard of Kensington, because it's sort of like the main, often profiled area in the country where the opioid epidemic is rampant. Walk through the neighborhood, people are falling down on the streets. They're laying on the streets. It's like living in sort of a zombie area. Kensington Corridor Trust, which I think was spearheaded by a architecture firm, started buying up property in this distressed area with the idea that let's get the community to invest and be owners in these properties so that they can decide how they will be used. Because what's going on all over, not just Philadelphia, but essentially for-profit real estate developers have essentially twisted what is property, particularly housing, right? And so they buy it up, they hold on to it until things start shifting. And that's the thing, gentrification is going on all over the place. And even in Kensington, where it is profiled nationally, is like, you do not want to go in this area. Developers were coming in and like, nope, we want it. We'll hold on to it till it gets better. And so Kensington Corridor Trust has gone through now. It's out of the hands of that particular architecture firm, and it is moving towards true community ownership and decision-making around who gets to participate in those buildings, encouraging businesses from BIPOC community. I kind of hate that word, Black, Indigenous, people of color, founders. And they have structured it in a way that essentially, hopefully, the last time we talked to them as a potential investment, we being the Valentine Foundation, they were structuring it was like, well, whoever sort of gets control of it, they can't sell it for 10 years as a way to protect them. It's like, well, we've already seen with low-income housing tax credit, even 45 years is too short. How do we make it permanently protected for doing good in the community, right? So that 45 years passes what's going on with low-income housing tax credits. Now, these people who've lived there for 30 years are being kicked out of their homes because now they're being sold for, $1 billion because it's in that area that's now being gentrified. So I love what they're doing. And the money that they're raising, she is raising, the executive director. Faith institutions are wonderful investors in that, particularly the faith institutions in that neighborhood, right? Because they're part of the neighborhood. So that's the kind of thing that faith institutions should be looking at. What's going on in your backyard and how are you engaged with those communities? And again, talk to the other faith communities in your backyard and how can y'all collaborate? Maybe some of you are really small, you can't do a large amount, that kind of thing. So that's one way. The other way is many cities now are following California. California is doing some serious stuff around reparations. They are holding these hearings with people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, I'm saying the name wrong maybe, but who wrote the seminal piece, The Case for Reparations. They've been having hearings. They have made progress in actually like giving land back, right? So in Philadelphia, we're not that, we haven't gone that far yet, but the Philadelphia Office of Faith-Based Initiatives coordinated and held a 4-day-long convening and training, and it was targeted to faith institutions. Please bring up to 3 people from your congregation or however you call it, right, in your faith institution. I attended with about 4 other members of my church. There were, I believe, 85 people in the room representing more than 30 institutions, including the mosques, the synagogues, the churches, and what's it called? I forget the society. I'll remember it in a minute. But anyway, so it was a diverse mixture. What'd you say? Somebody had a name, but anyway.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it was something else. But anyway, so we met for 4 days, challenging at times. But since then, that training, a group has continued to meet. So representatives have continued to meet. Some of them got involved with the local NCOBRA, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And we got a piece of legislation passed in Philadelphia in order to say we need to study reparations. So that's been passed. I'm now on a sort of steering committee for the reparations campaign here in Philadelphia. So that's the kind of thing, sort of see what's going on, because I think the conversation around reparations is happening in a lot of cities. And I think that is a great place for faith-based groups to explore, talk about. The other thing that I'm involved in is we have a group here called POWER, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. It is intentionally a multi-faith coalition that essentially leads from justice. What are the justice issues that we want to work on here in Philadelphia? It's about justice for our children, looking at the school system and essentially the downright racist allocation of funding. And so there's been a state case that Power supported, advocated for, that took about 7 years.
Oh no, I think you might have frozen, Vanessa. Okay, we'll wait a couple of minutes. Oh, we lost Vanessa, and I definitely do know she had a couple other things she did want to talk about. There's a lot for Vanessa to talk about, but I think she gave us 3 things already, and I know she had about 3 or 4 more. So we'll definitely send them out afterwards.
I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes. All right.
There you go. Sorry about that.
No,
no
worries.
I'm going to turn my video off because Zoom is a hungry creature. And because I was talking so much, it was probably taking more of the energy. So it just got tired and pulled me out for a moment. Let's see.
You had been talking about power and yep.
Yeah, so that multi-faith coordination. The other group that's doing multi-faith work here in Pennsylvania is Pennsylvania Interfaith, what is it? Interfaith, something in light. Sorry, I can't remember that name, but I'm starting to get involved with them. I'll admit that climate change, while I absolutely understand it, understand that it's real and am concerned about it, it wasn't an area that I delved into, but I was terrified this summer. And we didn't have that bad, but hearing about what was going on in other places and experiencing above 90 degrees in Philadelphia for more than a week just made me feel like, okay, all those disaster movies that I watched, we're living in it now. So I'm getting more involved with PAIPL. Interfaith Power and Light is what it's called. And what they do is essentially work also in a multi-faith strategy to get faith institutions to address it. And so a big thing they're trying to work on now is like solarizing their institutions and also sort of just spreading the word throughout the congregants in order to solarize. On a personal note, I just traded in my somewhat gas guzzler Ford for a Ford plug-in hybrid. So I'd love for that to be a campaign. And then finally, and it's picking up on what Derek talked about, everybody who's involved in a church understand how and where you're investing your money, including and especially at the local level. Faith institutions that are invested in Citibank and Wells Fargo and these large national banks, really ask yourselves, is that in alignment, not just with your faith, but with your local community? Probably not. look at your local credit unions, look at your local CDF, community development financial institutions, and also look at how is your money being invested. If you have an endowment, look at your policy and what, going back to that earlier conversation, what are the values of your denomination and your church? And is that reflected in your investment policy such that when you look at how and what you're choosing to put those investments in, are they in alignment? I'll
Thank you.
stop there.
Thank you. Well, and there's just one more thing, and then we're actually doing pretty good on time. You also talked about the Philly Move Your Money campaign.
Yes, 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 yes. So, right, let me go back to, and this is how you and I met, Nia. I think we at the Total Impact Conference, and I was on a panel. I'm not sure if I was talking about the public bank, but we sort of bonded on, yeah, Philly's been working on the public bank issue and Boston's been working on it too. So through Power, again, Philadelphia is organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. One of the campaigns we've been working on is to get a public bank for Philadelphia. And it actually went as far as passed a piece of legislation to get a Philadelphia a financing authority, which was the first step to then moving to getting a bank. And it passed 50-1, I think. Well, things got slowed down a little bit because the mayor wouldn't implement it. So we've lost a little momentum, but in order to keep moving forward, we said, okay, this was really about how Philadelphia's money, our tax revenue, all that money we collect in fees out of the national banks into the local community, or more, at least more in support of what Philadelphia needs. And so we said, let's move it from those revenues and really try to make it a more individual, institutional campaign, but also an individual campaign. So we're looking at, those of us in power, all of our faith institutions. How can we get our institutions, like I just encourage you all to do, talk to the finance committee, the investments committee, and say, hey, where are you all invested? Let's make sure we move our money locally so that we're supporting local things. So that's the Move Your Money campaign. In order to learn more about.
All right. And again, Vanessa, I think we'll be able to pop back in, but we can send some more information about it afterwards. So let's open it up for questions now. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I think that's probably enough time for maybe 1 or 2 questions answered thoughtfully. Take it away, Siona.
Hi. I apologize for being late, and I hope some of this was not, or if it's repetitive, just let me know. I think, so I am several of us on this Zoom is part of the Anchor Institution strategy. We're, team members, we're part of community or allied communities. And just one question that I was wondering is, well, as a faith-based institution, what would be kind of some things that we can kind of bring as Ujima to your faith leaders or committee members or congregants that could maybe help raise the awareness if they're not already involved with any type of race-based education in their congregation or community. What do you know or hear, or from your co-leaders, is either part of the problem or that could maybe help turn the tide to help them think about implementing or considering any sort of initiative that would identify the racial history of our, institution.
Can I take that, Nia?
Yep.
I'm going to try to keep my answer short because I think that's what's making me go out. Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. That should be the first and sort of seminal book. Edgar, Native American guy who worked in the foundation industry for more than 20 years, wrote a book called The 7 Steps to Decolonizing Wealth. And it is essentially a guidebook for how to recognize that the source of the wealth that any foundation endowment is holding is from stolen land, stolen labor, stolen bodies. And so therefore, here are the 7 steps to take us over that.
Thank you, Sienna. Derek, did you want to answer that question? I'm sorry. Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you, Sienna, for the question. Derek, did you want to answer as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to find ways to have this conversation as it aligns to the church's mission. And so it just happened to be around the time where we were establishing the concept of beloved community, and we started really asking the church to look inward to identify whether the church was measuring up against their own values. So this was primarily happening at the Christ Church Cathedral, which typically most Episcopal congregations in a city, they have a cathedral which is usually like the main office that supports kind of all of the other Episcopal churches throughout the city. So at the cathedral, one of the things they started doing was really looking at, for instance, started looking at their supply and like their procurement, and started identifying where they were spending their dollars for supply, and reverted those plans to start spending money with minority suppliers. Looking at issues such as how much energy was being spent. You wouldn't believe how much space in our churches that are not being used. When you look at the average congregation uses maybe 9 hours of time during the week in their building, meaning that the building is typically open an average of 9 hours for the whole week. And so imagine what else could be done in the community. A lot of churches in Cincinnati, I mean, they may not be having service, but they do have their building open for child care cooperatives to come in and manage after school care in their building. And it's actually a cooperative. And so there's many different things that congregations can do, but it's ultimately about having the discussion and asking the question, are we aligning with our values in the use of our building? Are we leveraging the assets in our community like we want to, or are those assets being locked up in funds and investment funds that don't really align with our mission? And those are the questions you just have to start asking. And ultimately you get enough people asking those questions, then in the church, I mean, this is something that every church should do. Just like every year you have to file your taxes, I think a church should look at their assets and continuously revise and look at whether or not their investments, their assets are aligning with their mission, and the use of those assets, especially.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We have more questions. We're definitely not going to have time for them all, but we have 4 minutes. And so I say that as I call on you, Louise, let's all work on being as concise as possible. Louise? And Louise, okay, yep.
My question is in some ways similar to some things that Theo says. Are you talking about converting churches into low-income housing or something? What about the NIMBYs? Some people in the congregation, like he's talking about, even them, they claim to be Christians. Something like Bill was saying about, when people approach preach it, they don't have the compassion. Like in South Boston, like Catholic Church, one that wanted to build elderly housing.
Louise, let's give them time. Let's make sure they can answer the question. I think they got the gist. So Vanessa,
They're saying they don't want the elderly housing
right.
in the neighborhood. And I'll add one more thing, that one my friend said, asked the priest about that, and he said he'll pray for it.
Okay. Y'all got that, Derek, Vanessa?
I think I got, yeah, the gist.
No, what is the question?
So I think Louise is picking up this notion of the space that a church has, and kind of saying, there's NIMBYism. So just in terms of community members who would kind of make it difficult, I guess, for a church to make full use of its assets in different communities.
And I'm talking about too is the affordable. When they want to convert it to affordable housing, there's a lot of trouble from the community, and even the congregants, people in the church, the congregation, don't stand up for it either.
And Louise, is this more of a question or an observation?
Well, it's a question and an observation, because I wonder, how do you handle this?
Okay, boom, there's a question. Thank you, Louise.
Yeah, I think I can, I've seen examples like Christ Church Cathedral here in Cincinnati. We went through a process of a 10-year strategic plan to look at how the church could be more outwardly in leveraging the church's assets in the community. And what this resulted was a year of conversations and listening sessions that resulted in the church agreeing to a $10 million fund to support affordable housing, primarily senior housing. But as with anything else, you do have church members that, feel, for instance, and to be quite honest, they feel that none of that money should be invested in the community, that it should remain in conservative type investments so the church can survive. And it's gotten into this kind of this idea or concept that churches are ultimately really just are keeping their assets until they so they can stay open as long as possible. And so they see it as a risk. And that's the conversation. A lot of the pushback comes from where people see other people as risk. And the idea is to change that around. And so, it's up to Christians, and it is part of the Christian faith to help the poor and to help the people that don't have much. And often that's not practiced. And even in our own congregations, not everybody necessarily feels that way. So, that conversation is always going to be difficult, but a church and, they are to be held to their values, and they all have a role to play in our community.
Thank you. And we are out of time. However, I do want to take the opportunity. I don't know if you're still here, James. I know that your hand was up, and I didn't know if you had a question or a comment, but would invite you, if you did have either put it in the chat. I do just want to read some of the additional questions that we had. So Geo question, which was in the chat, was, what is your approach when Christian folks, and maybe folks of other faiths, who use the phrases like end of times, fulfilling the prophecy, and other remarks that lead to spectating oppression, economic, racial, etc., and genocide even, just sitting back and letting things play out because of a scripture or two? I grew up Christian and am at a loss with some members of my communities. That was one question in the chat. And we're not going to be able to answer it live, but we figure we can at least give voice to it. Dorian asked, or said, the church members may have their own investment in 401k, etc. What efforts exist to educate the congregation so that their investments are consistent with their own Christian beliefs and values? And then again, James, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question or comment that you just want to at least voice? Although
Yeah, sure. I was like trying to write it out and I was like, So real quick, so shout out to you real quick. Oh, damn, did she leave?
This is still here.
Vanessa.
Are you looking
Oh,
for
yeah, I was just gonna say I'm from Philly. I was just saying, I love seeing the Philly love. But my question is, my experience is that I grew up in church and I didn't always witness churches being so transparent with their finances or like incredibly inclusive about like who comes into the finance committee. And so just it felt, I don't know. I guess for people who are in a like church culture where that isn't so like easily, like you can't just go up to them and be like, let me look at your investment portfolio. Like what is the like ways that people can sort of like build toward like getting to that point, you know what I mean? Like how do they sort of nurture trust or yeah.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that. And again, unfortunately, we won't be able to, because we're out of time, answer these questions live. However, as both Vanessa and Derek have mentioned, we're all in relationship with each other. So this won't be our last conversation. This conversation continues. And so we will definitely have other opportunities to continue this conversation. And so we'll make sure that when those opportunities arise, that we'll answer those questions. So thank you so much, Derek. Thank you so much, Vanessa. This was a rich conversation. If we can just really quickly, and Vanessa just dropped some things in the chat. I'll just go ahead and I'll do that. It's coming to me privately. So Vanessa said, and start with the denomination leadership and see what resources they have to help you train / educate, etc., to move toward value alignment with money and other things. So again, this conversation is not over. We will continue to have this conversation in multiple forms, but if we could give a round of applause, celebration for Derek and Vanessa, their generosity, their expertise, and their stories. Thank you so much, both. And until next time, which will be pretty soon, actually. And in the meantime, I will stop the recording so that we can close out this panel and transition into our member team meeting. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, everyone.